Hey everyone, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're located. Thanks for being here. We're really excited to have this conversation. I'm really honored to be here with three of my esteemed colleagues from Baker Tilly and some of their areas of expertise. We'll be introduced to them in a second, but just real quick, my name is Brad Fisher. I'm a director in our Baker Tilly digital practice. Been here about 10 years. We work helping organizations with back office transformations across HR, finance, supply chain. We work in a lot of different industries, but our biggest industry that we focus on is healthcare and something near and dear to my heart. So as we think of healthcare, that's payers, providers, and life sciences and the intersection of all three of these. And for this conversation, we're obviously going to be focusing deeply in the life science vertical within the healthcare industry. So just real quick to take a second on what we're going to cover. We'll go through and meet our panel here in a second. But really want this to be organic conversation for the most part of what we talk through. As you just heard, we welcome questions. Please put them in the chat. We have a lot of content, and if it'll be covered, we may skip over the questions a little bit and cover them at the end. So really excited to hear the questions that the audience brings. But you're going to hear a lot of things just around broad enterprise risk mitigation. What are the best practices that cover different avenues of it? We'll dive into both macro and micro elements. We'll break those down into internal and external for purposes of segmentation. And really, how does technology facilitate organizations thinking about it? So with further ado, let's jump into it. So I just introduced myself. Really excited to be here again. We have three of my other esteemed colleagues. Like I mentioned, you'll be very apparent that we don't pay a lot for haircuts. But maybe Darren, start with you.
Absolutely, thank you, Brad. Pleasure to be here. Glad everybody could join. My name is Darren Jones. I'm a partner here with Baker Tilly, and I lead our global life sciences industry team.
All right, Ben, over to you.
Thanks, Brad. Hi, I'm Ben Quigley, located in the Boston, Massachusetts area. I am a principal here at Baker Tilly, responsible for the risk advisory services we deliver in New England. I'm also a member of our firm's Global Life Sciences team and thrilled to join our audience and my colleagues today to speak about the dynamic risk landscape in the life sciences industry.
Thank you, Ben. Mario, last but not least.
Thank you, Brad, for the introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone on the call. I'm Mario Prohaski. I'm a director with our Life Sciences Global Advisory practice, working closely with Darren and Ben in our industry. I'm based in Philadelphia.
Thank you, Mario. All right, so kind of jumping into it, Darren, thanks for being here. I know you have a very busy schedule, so really appreciate you spending a time with us and our audience here. So let's start by talking to the audience about what you're seeing as you talk to many customers, many different organizations all over the world. What are you seeing and hearing from them in this dynamic industry around risk? How they're approaching it? What are some of the things that are keeping their C-suites up at night? And we'll start with that and start to drill into it.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. I mean, a couple of things to highlight. I mean, one, this obviously, I think this industry is fraught with risk, right? We speak often with C-suite executives on, how do they manage risk as a core competency in how they run the business, right? Driving a level of visibility and awareness into risk. And making sure their teams are armed with the tools and the resources they need to respond to it. And I think as an industry, we often struggle because our executive teams are being bombarded with risk on a daily basis, whether that's coming from healthcare compliance, whether it's coming from quality, coming from safety or product compliance. I mean, there's sort of a daily bombardment of risk indicators coming into life sciences organizations. And it's very easy to become maybe a little numb to it. It's also very easy sometimes for the audit committee or the risk committee to not have a full grasp or a full picture of the risk portfolio facing our clients. When when I look at kind of where the industry is now, kind of midway through 23, I'd say a couple of global threads or trends that I see playing out very heavily. This element of patient engagement and patient equity. We'll talk maybe a little bit if we get into it, on patient equity and what it means in terms of an ESG framework. But certainly, I think many in the industry have been pushing for, and now we're being held to a higher standard when it comes to affordability and accessibility of therapies. And that is really challenging, I would say, the construct of the typical patient support program, which is primarily in the U.S. provided to commercial covered patients to help fill funding and affordability gaps. But that doesn't necessarily represent all of the patient needs, that are out there that could be addressed, by our therapies. I would also say when we think about patient engagement, the level of interaction with advocacy. Last week I had an opportunity to attend the Chief Patient Officer Summit, where we had a great and robust conversation about the role of advocacy within the manufacturer, right? And how industry is engaging with advocacy groups. And one of the things I really highlighted is, as passionate and as proactive as we want to be in advocacy, that's not the only voice we have in the patient. And as an industry, we have risk when maybe there's an inconsistent tone being taken between advocacy and the patient support program. And when you think about the role of nurse ambassadors and some of the more, call it interventional elements of the patient support program, it's become a little bit of an arms race within the industry as companies are sort of one-upping each other in terms of the hands-on nature of their PSP, which is opening up a whole new avenue of risk. When we think about customer engagement, the evolution of the customer, we're constantly balancing the stakeholders of the stakeholders being patients, prescribers, payers. We all speak about having a patient-centric strategy, but what does that actually mean? And some of these stakeholders, right, both patients, doctors, and payers are increasingly demanding a more robust set of evidence. Evidence that goes well beyond, the endpoints in our pivotal trials. And that's putting a strain on both medical affairs and commercial departments. When you look at some of the recent, in the last year or two, Department of Justice settlements, with the pharmaceutical industry, now there's questions that are really being posed around peer-to-peer product education programs and when is an unmet educational need satisfied, which runs the risk of completely changing the construct of, the speaker programs that our clients are running, as a core part of their marketing strategy. As I mentioned in my opening remarks around convergence and these different risk programs and being bombarded by risk, I mean, there's a need to harmonize some of that voice, right? So how do we calibrate, the voice and the demand for risk management across the C-suite and drive that down in a responsible and accountable way, within our clients' management team structure. So at a high level, I would say those are some of the driving threads or trends that we see that are really fairly perplexing. And again, just given an industry where we are at risk on a daily basis, it makes those pain points a little bit more acute.
Yeah, and there's a lot to unpack there, and thank you for that. And I think the one thing I will summarize, and the rate of change for all of these risks is not slowing down either, right? It's almost becoming exponential. So building those foundational programs that allows organizations to be agile because you don't know what's around the next corner, right? That's going to be very imperative too, is that strategy and train of thought. So thank you. So let's kind of double click into some of these things. And like I said, we're gonna bucket these into internal risks and external risks, so we're not bouncing around here for the audience. So as we move into what we're gonna call internal risks, right? And we can move to the next slide. I honestly think, regardless of industry, one that is probably 1A and for almost every organization, but specifically in healthcare and in life sciences, is around data privacy and protection, right? So Mario and Ben, let's go to you for this one. Thank you both for being here for this great conversation. This is an area that is affecting everyone. So Ben, when you talk to customers and clients, what are some of the thoughts that you bounce around from a leading practice to manage these programs for organizations? And part two to that, what kind of blind spots typically organizations aren't seeing coming that we can kind of help get in front of?
Great question. Thanks, Brad. Life sciences, right? Organizations are becoming more and more dependent on data to inform their strategies and operations and to drive change that keeps them competitive in the marketplace. And I think today we're going to talk about change a lot. And I think that's going to be a theme to a lot of the conversation that we have. More regulation and public interest that's spilling into the sector due to things like digital healthcare, where patient data and its use is of significant focus. In addition, digital channels are becoming the preferred mode of engaging customers, which involves the collection of healthcare professional data, as well as the exchange of data between life science companies and customers. While data and data access creates opportunity, it also creates significant risk for the organizations, and they need to understand how to manage it. So let's talk about data privacy, data protection, two different concepts, but they both need to, they need to work hand in hand. First, I haven't talked with clients about the importance of understanding the regulation applicable to their organization. It's difficult, but critical. Inventorying and then understanding data regulation enables an organization to understand its responsibilities from the data privacy perspective. This helps define, first, what an organization can do with the data that they've collected and what control the organization has over the retention and use of the data. Perhaps one of the more difficult challenges is obtaining support and buy-in for the resources that are needed to develop a strong data privacy program. Leaders of the organization need to support the program build. They need to understand the threats as well as the opportunities to operations, organizational growth, and then the competitive advantages associated with a good data privacy practice. So oftentimes, the resources required for good data privacy is overlooked. So spending time bringing leadership along the journey is critical. Once an organization understands the data regulations applicable to them and how to use their data compliantly, oftentimes the conversation turns to how to protect that data they've collected. We talk with organizations about good data protection processes, data modeling, the performance of end user training, data regulation, and data management, engaging third parties that may come in contact with their data. We also talk a lot about developing data breach management practices and automating as much as possible. With these practices, we make it easier to handle the complexity of different regulations and make sure the data is being protected from both internal and external threats and risks. We could spend a lot of time talking about data management lifecycle, but at a high level, it's important to define it, establish the right governance for data management, and an organization should design and implement controls for data management and then test those on a routine basis. And I guess I'd say finally, it's important for data privacy and data protection programs to be designed and implemented with the end user of the data at the heart of their design. Keeping the end user in mind at every step of the journey leads to data compliance. It's important to understand and then educate end users on what data is being collected, why the data is being collected, and how long the data will be maintained. Data policies and procedures should be super easy to understand. And as you can imagine, the approach to data privacy and protection differs from organization to organization, as do the regulations, but there are some simple imperatives that should be applied by all. Mario, I know you have a long history of leading practices on the other side of the pond, where this topic has been around for a while. I believe you wanted to just add a couple of points specific to life sciences.
Yeah, happy to. Thank you, Ben. I think we can certainly learn a lot from how data privacy and data protection as topics have evolved since the implementation of GDPR a few years ago in Europe. And we've also seen how GDPR has led to further proliferation of other privacy and data protection requirements in the US and other parts of the world. So there's definitely a lot that we can continue to learn from how companies are operationally meeting data privacy and data protection requirements from a GDPR perspective. It still remains a challenge. And I think one of the big components of that challenge is the fact that these are topics that require a lot of cross-functional collaboration. So between the owners of data privacy and data protection and the business, whether that's our commercial, medical, clinical R&D stakeholders within our organization. So that is a continuous challenge because we need to be able to translate that cross-functional collaboration into effective data privacy and data protection tools. So if we think about GDPR, this is going to be your ensuring that you are using the appropriate standard contractual clauses, ensuring that your records of processing activities are updated continuously and really reflect the nature and extent of data processing activities that occur within the organization. So this is an ongoing process which requires organizations to collaborate well within functions, but also requires a certain level of agility that is important. And one thing I'll notice, this is timely given the recent adequacy agreement that was issued by the European Commission, which will hopefully make that a little bit easier in terms of data transfer and data protection compliance between Europe and the US. But even that in itself will require companies to think about how to implement the provisions of that adequacy agreement effectively within their data privacy and data protection programs. And I see that probably as an important challenge in that context in the next few months. One thing I will, to close just here on this topic, as we think about digital transformation, digital assets, it's really important to ensure that we select those digital assets from and use the right kind of vetting process that will also ensure that privacy controls are embedded and that privacy is really sort of front and center when you're making decisions with regards to your digital and data assets that you're deploying.
I mean, Mario, it's kind of maybe a little bit of a to be determined on the enforcement side of this, but going back to maybe some of my opening comments on the patient support programs, right, and the very hands-on approach that we see clients taking in the U.S. specifically, on the patient support program. I mean, I'm just curious, what are some of your thoughts, right, on where some of those key risks in the execution of the PSP exist, and maybe a best practice or two that you would advise companies to follow?
I think, it's if we take that again from a data protection perspective, I think it's really about making sure that PSPs and situations when data exchange is occurring between our organizations and maybe our vendors that are supporting with the setup or execution of those programs, that you are really putting data protection and data privacy front and center. So you're having the right contractual agreements between the various parties, and then you're really ensuring the protection of sensitive data. I'll also note that the nature of how PSPs may be set up may vary a little bit from geography to geography. So having awareness of what the compliance requirements there are in certain countries in Europe versus the US is going to be critical as well. But I think what we're also seeing is companies really having to continue to ensure that cross-functional collaboration between the data protection offices and the patient engagement and patient support teams to ensure that those programs are set up compliantly from a privacy and data protection perspective.
Yeah. And I maybe just add, I think we continue to see, not as many companies as I would expect exercising those right to audit clauses with hub and specialty pharmacy, partners who are helping to drive the claims adjudication, the prior authorization, and obviously the script fulfillment efforts. And they are paid vendors of the manufacturer, and we do have a risk there. And again, we see the claims being audited. We see some aspects of the program being reviewed, but a largely internal audit and compliance for a lot of organizations not taking a very proactive approach in doing those audits.
No, this has been great, and I know we could probably spend hours just talking on this topic alone. But since we only have an hour here, I want to keep it moving. And Darren, Mario, staying with that conversation piece there. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about commercialization risk. Another area I know you could probably speak for a day on. And from your perspective, what are some of the risks that life science companies may not necessarily think about when it comes to their commercialization strategies and the risks associated to it? And then part two to that question is how should they think about these when encompassing them into their broader strategy?
This is indeed a great topic, Brad, and one that we can discuss at length. So I'll try to maybe segment this a little bit based on kind of the type of companies where we're talking about here. So if we start off with maybe companies that are pre-commercial and they're looking to commercialize a product for the first time, I think their commercialization risk is a little bit different than maybe a company that's already established that is just looking to expand or enhance its existing portfolio. And if I take the pre-commercial companies as a starting point, I think there the crux of the matter is really that sort of the need to successfully transition from what is essentially oftentimes a very science research-led organization to one that is able to commercialize effectively, regardless of how you plan to commercialize your products and what your strategy is. And I think that transition is fraught with risk and it requires a lot of attention. And it's fraught with risk because it requires a change in culture in some ways, but also obviously a focus on building much more extensive and robust governance and operational processes that will allow that commercialization to take place effectively. From my perspective, one of the things that we often kind of discuss with clients is the need to really begin to think about commercialization early on, even in terms of kind of how you're defining your evidence generation strategy, how you're defining potentially your early outreach to payers from a market access perspective. And when you do that, I think oftentimes companies sort of may potentially kind of underestimate the need to do that fairly early on in the process and really embedding that commercial thinking early on in their scientific strategy and in development of their research. That's just on sort of that kind of science to commercial transition in terms of the product pipeline, but the organizations will also need to shift dramatically in terms of governance, in terms of operations, in terms of compliance requirements. And what companies oftentimes struggle with is being able to sequence those transition steps at the right time from a commercial perspective. So there's definitely a need to kind of continue to pay attention to that transition and to really be able to address those risks at the right time, given the commercial stage of development of the company.
Mario, I'm gonna build on that for a quick minute, but you talked about the evidence, right? And I think oftentimes it's really difficult for research scientists to take an objective view of the primary endpoints of a study. They believe if the science is good, that the science is marketable. But let's be clear, not all good science is marketable. And some of the constraints on the marketing, right, really have created a lot of strategic execution challenges for many innovative biotech companies, right? Essentially either having study endpoints that require a tremendous amount of upfront market education to HCPs before you can even get into your efficacy and safety data and sales points, and how do you plan for that? And a lot of that is rooted in evidence. I think I would also highlight patient-reported outcomes and other, call them secondary sources of evidence that can be used in a market access and commercial strategy. And these are questions that we're seeing coming in from payers more often in some of those negotiations. So this element of when do you stop kind of gathering evidence on innovation, right? And this element, I feel like we're in a renewed sense that evidence generation and evidence strategy really needs to coincide with the product life cycle. And we see far too many companies still relying upon their pivotal trial to generate the evidence or to have the evidence to support the claims they're making in the market. And it can be quite limiting. And from a compliance and a risk management point of view, the older that evidence gets, the more aggressive we see organizations, putting that evidence out there, which is going to open them up to different, risks of enforcement, related activity, if they believe that market's already been educated. So now what are you talking about at the program or in your marketing strategy 2 years post PDUFA? So I really want to emphasize that scientific evidence because, how that feeds into phase 4 research, how that feeds into ongoing HEOR, there's a continuous element of evidence I feel is, for a lot of organizations being a bit neglected. And we've got strategic execution risk, when we start working off of older evidence and not generating new data.
Thanks for that, Mario and Darren. And that actually flows well into the next area I want to cover. You're talking about organizations really being on the forefront of innovation, being able to have all of this data, right, and have evidence to back up their strategies. You can't do that without human capital, right? You can't do that without great people. That's the lifeblood of so many of these organizations, is having the people to innovate and execute on these strategies. So my next question, and anyone can answer, but Ben, maybe I throw it to you to start. The world is constantly changing, right? And organizations are needing to attract and hire and develop, retain talent, and find their top talent and try to retain them. We're seeing attrition levels going up. With this comes costs of wage inflation, areas like that. So what are the, all of the roles that life science organizations are doing are very high demand and low supplies. Many of them have PhDs, right? So that just extrapolates the supply and demand gaps. So my question is, what are you seeing organizations doing to attract the right talent to their organizations? And more importantly, trying to retain and develop them so that they don't get poached by their competitors and that they can have long careers helping innovate for those organizations that bet on them.
Yeah, Brad, let me touch on attracting talent. I'm going to use risk stewards as sort of the subject or focus of what I'm going to share. And then maybe we can touch on developing and retaining talent towards the end. Something that I've seen more of recently is organizations focusing on flexibility in roles as well as where their employees focus their time. And in the risk management space, I see organizations shifting people between the 3 lines. A member of management can be brought on as a subject matter specialist in an internal audit engagement. Internal audit and enterprise risk management, with the right controls in place, are working together more and more to perform things like risk assessment activities. This does 2 things, right? It provides individuals with differentiated experience, and it enables organizations to employ flexible staffing arrangements that can have cost-saving outcomes. Another great example is analytics. Everybody wants to use analytics. There are many internal audit teams today that don't have the need for a full-time team member focused specifically on analytics, but that internal audit function may want to start using analytics in the work that they do. One of a few solutions to this is leveraging a team member from across the organization. It doesn't necessarily have to sit in internal audit, that has that analytics expertise, and perhaps they sit in a shared service center or they're a member of the IT team. Team members with the analytics skill set can be leveraged on a part-time basis by internal audit and perhaps other functions across the organization. One of my clients is creating a new legal entity, which will be focused on a new revenue engine and new sources of revenue, different from what the main entity focuses on today. And they're keen on establishing a shared services model so that they can do just this. Share team members and create flexibility, while at the same time giving their employees opportunities to differentiate their focus and their ability to contribute to the organization's success in differing ways. Brad, do you want to just hit on developing and retaining talent as well?
Yeah, and I know your focus there was really on the attracting the talent and definitely hit the mark there. But some of the things, as I heard you speak, really actually is part of the strategies we're seeing more and more organizations about retention as well. Right? It's one thing to attract people, but to keeping them is another. So, 5-10 years ago, if someone left, an HR organization just said, okay, let's go find someone else to hire. But now, our job market, the under 4% unemployment rate, especially in North America, you can't just go do that. So organizations are thinking about, how do we make sure that we focus and retain our top talent? And they're building a buy, build, borrow strategy. Obviously the buy is actually going and attracting them and hiring them, but how do we give them flexible arrangements that you just articulated so well, right? What are the areas that they don't know that they want to learn as technologies evolve, as you mentioned, data analytics, as the sciences evolve, right? Maybe they move around, maybe they're interested in moving into different areas within the organization. These are all pretty new strategies from an HR perspective we're seeing to make sure that we're focusing on the values that the people want to build their careers, which isn't always about money, based on the different demographics. So it's really understanding, listening to the employees, understanding what they want. And a lot of times it's just learning new things, becoming better at areas that they haven't been able to touch. Succession planning is very important, and that's really in the building aspect of it, as I built out from the buy, build, borrow. So it's really interesting. I can talk for hours on this as well, but wanted to kind of cover that.
Yeah, I mean, Brad, you and Ben both touched on it, right? I mean, there is a profound shortage of talent, right? I mean, it is a very real risk. Ben, I love Boston, I love your hometown, but man, that is a difficult place to attract and retain talent in our industry right now. We're seeing. Of course, we're advisors, we're on the outside, but I mean, we are seeing clients warring with one another, over limited resources, and especially in geographic areas like in the Boston metro area. I think that both of you highlighted kind of creative approaches to solving some of that shortage, right? I mean, I do think we need to, as an industry, to think more creatively in how we are resourcing and deploying labor. We've seen almost cards being played out of the tech playbook, where we're seeing our clients establishing more distributed workforces, establishing physical presences in more than one biotech or life sciences hub, right? So maybe a Boston company, but they're establishing significant New Jersey or Philadelphia area operations, just for the purpose of trying to attract and get themselves engaged in a broader talent pool.
Yeah. No, very well said. And yeah, I'm married to a Bostonian, so I'm impartial to that area as well. So one more important question, and it came up as one of the top answers on our polls, of what's keeping our people up at night in the audience, is around the manufacturing supply chain risks, right? Obviously, it's something that's always been there, but I think they've been shined a big spotlight on it since the pandemic, right? And this is something that continually is evolving as with time. So Darren, starting with you from a top down, thinking from a strategic level. I know from previous conversations we've had, really the answer to this is fluid, right? But would love for you to talk about how organizations are thinking about strategies about manufacturing processes. If it's rather, can they bring it in-house? Do they use external outsourced 3PLs? There's pros and cons to each, but what are some of your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. Maybe it's a buzzword of the post-pandemic and pandemic world, right? But the idea of a hybrid approach, this idea of, look, we all realized during the pandemic some of the difficulty in just keeping the supply chain moving, right? Resource constraints, logistics constraints, were really profound for many manufacturers. On the same token, from an industry standpoint, our products are getting much more complex, right? The biologics are much more difficult to produce. So for a period of time, 3PLs and even contract manufacturers, some of their technical ability wasn't quite there. They've definitely seized on the opportunity presented by the pandemic. So we've definitely seen, those vendors really improving and enhancing some of their, development capacity. I think as a manufacturer, we are faced with a really tough question. I mean, when moving these products, these innovations out of the clinic and preparing them for commercialization, the reality is in rare disease and in other specialty markets, I mean, we are still going after such a small patient population, that sometimes it gives us a smaller base to recover some of those costs when we start thinking about the cost of insourcing some of that production.
And at the same time, how do we, if we do go down the path of insourcing production, how do we make sure that we've got a contingency plan? And does a contingency plan, does that necessitate that you, kind of have a contract for a designated production suite with one of your vendors, with a contract manufacturer? If you are going to have that contingency space, how do you operationalize it? How do you make sure you can, do smooth cutovers? How do you make sure that's all, kind of meeting all of your FDA validation and quality standards? Because even a contingent space still obviously needs to be, fully validated, right? And you need to go through the efforts to qualify, even the conversion or the cutover, when moving from one of those spaces. So I do think, as we're talking about the shortage of talent, as we just talked about, that has definitely impacted many of our clients' ability to efficiently scale up in-house production operations. So one of the advantages of obviously going with a contract manufacturer or with a 3PL, is just the benefit of scale, right? They generally have the human capital, which, if trained and if the SOPs are well established, they often are able, to meet many of the production, requirements. But needless to say, the cost of said services has also gone up exponentially,
as a result of greater demand, because everybody is looking for primary as well as secondary production space. So a lot of these suites are being allocated to customers, even if they're not actually being utilized. And that's just made the supply and demand economics not work in favor right now of the manufacturers. But a very difficult equation, and one where the economics and that buy versus build, equation, I think continues to evolve. And honestly, to the extent that a hybrid model makes sense, that gives you the ability to flex, as economic conditions shift, which, again, we can't, as wonderful as it is to have 4% unemployment, probably, 0.4% in our particular industry for the skill sets we're talking about, right? There's probably no such thing as unemployment. Maybe at some point, the supply and demand changes there. But right now, we need to plan for flexibility in that model, for at least the next 36 to 48 months.
And Brad, if I may add here, I think one of the ways in which companies are trying to address those challenges and be better about planning and executing their manufacturing processes is through the use of AI. So, thinking about how we manage our manufacturing process, how we manage our batch tracking, how that translates into our purchasing requisitions and purchase orders, and eventually feeding into our GL. There's a lot of opportunity that I think companies are seeing in terms of using AI to make better decisions in the context of their manufacturing and supply chain. I think that's just the beginning, right? I think it almost feels like a tidal wave that is coming, but we're still yet to see the full effects of that on supply chain, on manufacturing, of course, on many other processes within life sciences.
Yeah, and there's no doubt. I mean, AI is coming as a tidal wave, to use your phrase. And I know organizations of all sizes, and we see, doing things still on spreadsheets that they shouldn't do, right? Going back to human risk aspects of it. It really makes me think of there's crawl, walk, run capabilities that even before you get to, artificial intelligence and, ChatGPT, the things that can be done. One example pops in my head is a life science organization that we're actually implementing Oracle Cloud for them from a manufacturing perspective. They were building, they built kits, and there was a lot of pieces that had to have different temperature controls in it, right? So it wasn't the actual manufacturing of it that was the issue, where there was human risk. It was actually when things were put in different warehouses before they were shipped. So they had to be, taken apart, and then when they had to go back to be put together, they had stickers on things, and there was all kinds of, we would say that's a major risk added to it. And we just came in and with simple barcoding, was able to automate these things. So when things were shipped, we knew for every lot that the right components were going in for every lot for that shipment and taking the risk out of play. So it's just a great example of kind of, as you talk from an automation perspective, was wanted to share that.
Yeah, and Brad, I mean, there you're talking about the intersection between the manufacturing execution systems. You're talking about some process system validation related, initiatives, which again, there's significant, human capital expertise necessary to really make sure we drive the proper configurations, right, of the technology solutions that are available to us, which are evolving at a very rapid pace. And let's be honest, I mean, the evolution of technology is not keeping up with the evolution of validation capability, right? So it's like every time we have one of these technological innovations we want to take advantage of in the production line or somewhere else, it's almost like we have to slow things down for the somewhat archaic, system validation process where we've got to slow things down. And our quality teams for a lot of organizations have not been as adept at keeping up with the changes in technology to make sure that we can maintain, validated and compliant systems. And that relationship between, call it the CTO and the head of the quality management system, I mean, that is a relationship that is absolutely essential, when we're looking at the pace of innovation.
Yeah. No, I know this is something we could keep the conversation going for a while here as well. But to kind of move on, I know we have 15 minutes left. We want to touch on some of the external risks because there's some big rocks out there that I know the audience wants us to touch on. So if we can move to the next slide and show off some of our external risks. Let's start with what was number one in our poll. Legislation, regulatory risks, right? This should be a no-brainer that this is the highest one that everyone's thinking about. So Darren and Mario, we're going to toss the softball up to both of you. With all of the changes, the increased regulatory vigilance, legislative vigilance we're seeing both here in North America and EMEA and APAC, what are you seeing and hearing? What's changing? What's not changing on how organizations are building their moats, right, to protect and manage all of the dynamic that's happening around this area?
I think there's obviously a lot that we can talk about here, but I would use actually the comparison that Darren made in the last question around just compliance programs need to keep up with change, and I think that still remains a challenge. It's the same with kind of what we see on the quality and manufacturing side, where processes and technology is evolving, and we are struggling to keep up. In some ways, I think there's you see the same from a compliance perspective, where not only is regulation changing and evolving, but also the business continues to evolve at pace, and we're having to adapt to that from a compliance program perspective. I'll just highlight a couple of areas where I think that's particularly true. I mean, since the pandemic, we've seen a tremendous shift in the way we engage with customers, whether those HCPs or patients or other external stakeholders. We moved into a much more diversified digital way of engaging them through various digital channels, and including obviously on social media. And I think we as compliance professionals are still struggling in some ways to adapt to that, with how to manage interactions through social media, how to manage interactions with social media influencers, other stakeholders that are active in that space. Yes, there's some regulation also and some guidance that's coming out, particularly in Europe, but also in the US on this. But I think we're still having to adapt to that environment and to those changes in the way we engage with customers. And I think part of the challenge there is to ensure that we still maintain the same level of kind of key compliance principles that are already in place across our program, but just adapt them to the mode of operating that we're seeing the business shift to. That, I think, also means that the compliance professionals and compliance teams that we work with are continuously challenged to be present in the room. So when the business is having those conversations around new ways of engaging customers, around social media engagement and things like that, just making sure that compliance is present in the room in those conversations, continues to be an active and engaged business partner. And I think that is a challenge that if overcome, will allow compliance programs to keep up with that pace of change that we're seeing from a business perspective. There's, of course, many other things that we can talk about. And Darren, I wonder if you want to add a couple of points here. But to me, it is that continuous need to keep up with the pace of change in some areas like social media and even patient engagement that we are continuing to see compliance clients struggle with.
I mean, look, that's been a change in the industry's business model, right? As we've moved closer to the patient, right? I mean, the business model that most commercial medical affairs teams the governance around them are really got established in early 2000s, late 90s thinking, or when, for the most part, the entire industry was either in primary care or in oncology, and today it's just completely different. And many of those primary care constructs just do not fit the business model for an innovative med tech company or a rare disease, organization on the biotech side. And you were highlighting, Mario, some of the patient attributes. I mean, I struggle observing kind of clients who, are still putting, I would say, foundational elements of a compliance program in place, and they just don't have the wherewithal or the data or the ability to partner, on some of these more pertinent topics like advocacy and the patient support program. So I would really kind of take that as my point of emphasis. The level of data sharing that is happening right now between pharmaceutical manufacturers and individuals that are supporting advocacy and patient support efforts, many of which include PHI. I mean, it is a rock that needs to be turned over for a large number of organizations.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. No, appreciate that. So Ben, how you doing, Ben? Been quiet for a little bit.
Ready to go.
All right. Well, now we're down to the last 8 minutes here. So maybe kind of pivot a little bit here and want to talk about cybersecurity risk for a little bit. We hear almost every day about a new hack, across just about every industry. So if you could summarize kind of 3 things our audience should think about from the cybersecurity perspective to help mitigate strategies, what would you tell them?
I'm glad you confined it to 3 because in 8 minutes we really couldn't unpack this one, but we'll go with it. So we all know cybersecurity continues to be breaking news, and that's irrespective of the sector of the industry. And it's become significant. It's just a significant part of business today, right? We're always thinking about it. More than 10% of my clients alone had a cyber incident, this past year that impacted their business. And cyber criminals are focused on the life sciences industry in particular for a variety of reasons. One basic reason is the enormous amount of money involved with unearthing new science and products. They also target the industry because of the personal data they can obtain. Think about the patient data, the health records, other sensitive data like payment information. And then there's also a focus on the vast amount of intellectual property that exists. Think about the data that life science organizations have, much of which today is maintained digitally. Many organizations, whether they're startup biotechs or mature commercial operations, they depend on that data they've gathered for their success. I'm going to hit 3 topics, I consider them critical, particularly for organizations that are, up and coming and perhaps not as mature, but for whatever reason, these continue to be items or areas that end up, impacting organizations if they don't shore them up. One, and this is, passwords, something that can be thought of as obvious and simple. This is one of the biggest threats to an organization. Passwords should be closely protected through strong corporate policies, good practices and controls in place, and education for employees. A lot of the times, that's all the cyber criminal needs to gain access to your account. We had a client last year that had a threat actor gain access to the employee's email through a likely phishing attempt. That employee had their passwords recorded in a file in the saved email. That was the keys to the castle. That threat actor now had access to many of the other systems, including the company payroll system. I won't go into the details, but you can imagine, things that could happen if an external threat actor in particular had payroll system access. Luckily, the incident was not one that resulted in major monetary damages, and most likely was a wake-up call, but the impact could have been, much more severe. MFA, or multi-factor authentication. Once installed, MFA enhances security by requiring users to identify themselves more than just the user name and password. while username and password are important, and we just talked about it, they're vulnerable to things like brute force attacks when, which is a hacking method that's uses trial and error to crack passcodes, login credentials, and encryption keys. While MFA may be table stakes to some organizations, many still haven't adopted it. We performed a NIST cyber assessment recently, and one of the findings for one of our clients was that the client had considered but not installed MFA. Unfortunately, they waited to install it, and it ended up being the reason why they're hacked and had critical data stolen, and that data was held for ransom. And then the last one that I key in on, and something I continue to see, organizations sort of struggling with, is third-party vendor use. Many organizations use third-party vendors and service providers to support their IT needs, everything from system applications to services provided by IT vendors. Both large and small organizations use third parties. It's just a fact of doing business. Big organizations do as they scale and have more needs for additional support and tools. Small organizations, because they need IT support they may not have internally. Understanding the risks that are extended by using those third-party service providers is critical. Again, the size of the organization often gives way to the different risks posed. For bigger organizations that have many third parties, developing a program to manage third-party risk needs to occur, but can be challenging if not being done right and with the right specialization. For smaller organizations, they may not immediately need that comprehensive program, but they need to evaluate the risks that their third parties are assuming by being part of their operating ecosystem. And when doing so, organizations need to know what to look for. It's easy to say, hey, my vendor has a SOC report performed, so I should be good. But that shouldn't be the final answer. Understanding the risks that the third party is managing for you, understanding the controls they have in place, and making sure there are no gaps is something that should be completed. That can start with requesting a vendor SOC report, which lays out the controls they perform in providing services or a product to you, but it really shouldn't stop when the SOC report is received.
It's a lot there, Ben. Really appreciate it. We're down to our last couple minutes here. So I want to thank you for those in the audience that submitted some questions. We'll take those offline in the last couple minutes. If anyone else has any questions, please submit them with your names as well, and we'll answer those offline. But I just want to say thank you to the three folks. Really appreciate it. I know we could speak for hours and hours on this. As we think about everything that we covered, I know we just scratched the surface really on how deep we can go. Darren, any closing remarks you want to leave the audience with?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's, this is not easy stuff, right? I think it's also very easy to be lulled into a state of complacency, when it comes to risk and what we're doing as an organization to manage risk. We talk about technological innovation, we talk about human capital, right? We talk about a whole host of things that are very tangible risks, but yet manifest in many different parts of the organization and manifest differently for different organizations, depending upon how you are structured. So I think my comment is just kind of an eyes wide open comment, right? I mean, we can't allow ourselves to be lulled into complacency when it comes to risk identification and risk management. We need to be proactive and consistently proactive, and the pace of change is making us have to revisit some of these decisions much more often. And I think in a lot of respects, the governance structure, of the clients, right? The enterprise risk management governance structure really needs to be enhanced to make sure that we are fully leveraging the executive committee and the board to ensure proper oversight and management of mission critical risks. And they do change. They are not static.
No, I think those are great words of wisdom there. Once again, thank you to the three of you. Everyone that's from an audience perspective, thank you for joining. Everyone can have this deck that we have and with our contact information. So we welcome the opportunity. Feel free to reach out to any of us. Happy to continue the conversation offline, and hope everyone has a great rest of your day and rest of your week. So thank you again.